Happy Monday, everybody. I hope that you had a good weekend, and I hope that you had a really good Father's Day and celebrated with your dad and maybe got him a really good gift. I, went to church for Father's Day. Typically, that's what we do. Father's Day, Mother's Day, they all land on Sundays, so that's what we do. We just go to church, and we honor the fathers during church and give out gift cards to, you know, sometimes I'll ask questions like, who the oldest father is. They even, I think yesterday, the oldest that had attended church yesterday was 90. And then they asked about pocket knives and all the men that had pocket knives with them. Then he was like, okay. And then he asked if anybody had an old timer, and there was only one, so he won. And then they were looking for the father who drove to church in the oldest vehicle. And we missed it by 1 year. So ours is a 2001. The guy that won was a 2000. So very close to my dad getting a gift card, maybe to go to IHOP or even Cracker Barrel. Um, but it's all fun and games, and it was very enjoyable. It was a very good day. My brother came to church and with his wife and my nieces. So it was a good time. And sometimes you just feel better when you go to church. You know what I mean? I mean, if you don't go to church, you obviously don't know that feeling, but I do. And I think it feels better. Anyway, aside from that, since I forgot to do it last Friday, happy Father's Day to all the fathers out there. Um, they're trying to, just like they did with Mother's Day, they want to get rid of Father's Day because apparently, the left believes that anybody can be a father. However, people with, two brain cells to rub together know that that's not true. A father has to be a man, and it doesn't have to be a biological father. It can be a stepfather, but it has to be a man. A father is a man, period. Now, that is not what I'm here to talk about today. I don't know if this is going to take up the whole episode, but what I am here to discuss today is something that I saw this morning when I woke up and I was getting prepared to start recording, and I saw this on um, Dinesh D'Souza's podcast. And being from Texas, it irked me. It made my blood boil. So, what is going on is there are some authors that wrote a book called Forget the Alamo. And they said that we have the Texas origin story all wrong. Now, granted, you know how the left is. They like to rewrite history, blah, 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 blah. I obviously looked into it and have stuff to back up that their claims are not correct. But let's just see what it has to say, okay? This is from NPR, and it doesn't say who wrote this. Oh, Dave Davies. Okay, so it says, remember the Alamo? According to Texas lore, it's the site in San Antonio where, in 1836, about 180 Texan rebels died defending the state during Texas's war for independence from Mexico. The siege of the Alamo was memorably depicted in a Walt Disney series and in a 1960 movie starring John Wayne. But three writers, all Texans, say the common narrative of the Texas Revolt overlooks the fact that it was waged in part to ensure slavery would be preserved. Now, the fact that we know that these authors are Texans, I think we need to revoke their Texas citizenship and kick them out. That's just my opinion. You know, sometimes people that live in Texas that really enjoy their state and their freedom and realize that they have a lot more freedoms than most of the other states in the country, even though we should all have the same amount because we all have the same constitution federally. So people that really love their state, they take it seriously when people try to, you know, um, cast accusations of things that aren't true and to make Texans look bad, and the fact that, us that would defend it, well, they would say we were racist because we defend the true history. Um, but they're just making up their own stuff. Let's just keep reading and see what else it has to say. Um, Slavery was the undeniable linchpin of all of this, author Brian Burrows says. It was the thing that the two sides had been arguing about and shooting about for going on 15 years. And yet it still surprises me that slavery went unexamined for so long. In their new book, Forget the Alamo, Burrow and co-writers Chris Tomlinson and Jason Stanford challenge common misconceptions surrounding the conflict, including the notion that Davy Crockett was a martyr who fought to the death rather than surrender. Most academics now believe, based on Mexican accounts and contemporary accounts, that in fact Crockett did surrender and was executed, Burrows says. The story of the Alamo has been central to the whole Texas creation myth, Burrows says, but he adds it's past time to look critically at the heroic Anglo narrative associated with the site. One of the reasons that it matters most is that Latinos are poised to become a majority in Texas, according to census data, he says. So if there's ever been a time for there to be a robust civic conversation about this, about the place of the Alamo in our history, about Texas history itself, we hope it was now. How Texas history often fails to address slavery. It still surprises me that slavery went examined for so long, but then you have to understand the Texas Revolt for 150 years was largely ignored by academics, in part because it was considered declassé. What the heck is that? It was considered provincial, and because the state government of Texas, much as they're doing now, has for 120, 130 years made very clear to the University of Texas faculty and to the faculty of other state funded universities that it only wants one type of Texas history taught, and that if you get outside those boundaries, you're going to hear about it from the legislature. I don't know about that. Um, I distinctly remember learning in my school, Texas, about Texas history and about slavery and the abolitionists. And we learned about Harriet Tubman. We learned about all these people that fought to protect slaves that ran away. The Underground Railroad, we learned about that. I mean, we learned a lot about that stuff. In fact, it almost felt like that's the only thing we learned about in Texas history was slavery and the abolitionists and to stop it, the fight to stop it. That's all I remember learning. I remember talking about the battle at the Alamo, but I really can't pull anything from the Texas history that I learned in school other than slavery. That is all that I can bring to mind that I learned. Now, maybe it's because I have a bad memory sometimes, but that's just what I can recall is a lot of talk about slavery and the fight to end it. Um, on how Mexican Americans were largely written out of Texas history. The Tejanos, who were the Texians' key allies and a number of which fought and died at the Alamo, were entirely written out of generations of Texas history, as it was written by Anglo writers. This was mirrored very much in the kind of ethnic cleansing that went on after the Revolution, in which hundreds of Tejanos were pushed out of San Antonio and Victoria and existing towns, their lands taken, laws passed against their ability to marry white women and hold public office, on the myth that the Alamo defenders fought to the death. Mexican General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna is coming north with 6,000 troops. The Alamo defenders had maybe 200 guys at essentially an indefensible open-air Spanish mission. There has always been this great mystery of why on earth Lieutenant Colonel William Travis and James Bowie stay, and the best argument there is probably because they believe reinforcements would be forthcoming. Every other day they send out these plaintive, dramatic letters asking for reinforcement that, by and large, never came. But the truly perplexing thing is that in the 2 weeks leading up to the arrival of Santa Anna's forces in San Antonio, Travis and Bowie are getting almost daily warnings of the progress. They know they're coming, and yet still they stay there. It makes absolutely no sense of why they stayed there, except for the fact that these are the men who, by and large, have never been in war. You get a sense that Travis never really believes something bad can happen to him. I mean, the idea that Mexican soldiers would show up and kill them all just seems like a notion that he never really accepted. That somehow something would happen to spirit them all the way to safety. And of course, it doesn't happen. And of course, this leads to one of the great myths, which is the bravery of the Alamo defenders, how they fought to their death and everything. And when you look at the facts, they never made a conscious decision to fight to the death. There was no line in the sand drawn. Okay, so I have a problem with this depiction because there have been a lot of times when, in the face of defeat, they know they're outnumbered, they know there's no way to win, and they most likely are going to die, and people still stand their ground and fight whatever battle they're fighting. And this has happened all throughout history, all over the world, because when you feel like you are fighting for what's right, you don't just run away because you face imminent death. Some people would martyr themselves and stand there and say, "Yeah, we knew we were right and we weren't backing down, even if that means that we die." And do you know what happens when people do that and they stand in the face of death and they don't back down? It gives people that see and hear this story more courage to also do the same thing. It builds up courage and morale that, man, if he can do it, so can I. That's kind of why people do that kind of stuff. I mean, this whole, I'm invincible and nothing bad's going to happen to me. I don't believe that that was his mindset at all. Not that we're going to know because, obviously we don't know what was in their minds, what they were thinking. But I don't believe that this was the mindset. This is the mindset of, let's take a millennial today, a millennial leftist thinking that they're invincible and nothing will ever happen and they're going to live forever. You don't get that mindset back in the 1830s. I think you know very darn good and well that you're going to die and probably die young, be it from disease, battle, whatever. And also, men back then were actually men, they weren't beta males. So, continuing on, what we know now is because Mexican accounts from Mexican officers and soldiers, a number of them, a dozen of them have come to light over the last 50 years, show that between a third and a half of the Texas defenders actually broke and ran. They ran out into the open where they were unceremoniously run down and killed by Mexican cavalry. Now, neither we nor the academic authors who first found this say that this means anybody was a coward. It was just that the place was overrun. It wasn't like every man fought to his death in place, as generations of historians have taught us. I don't even think that I was taught that every man stood and fought to the death. You had your leaders that did, but just soldiers, I don't think I ever remember hearing that they all stayed and fought and no one turned and ran to try and escape. I could see other people doing that, but that doesn't mean everybody did, and that doesn't mean that nobody did. We don't really know everything. I mean, not everything was written down, obviously, and I don't see anything wrong with people getting scared and running, but I don't think the leaders were doing that. I don't think your generals were doing that. On how the 1960 John Wayne movie The Alamo perpetuated these myths. Wayne made the movie basically because he wholeheartedly believed that America was falling apart, that it was going to the dogs, and that somebody needs to stand up for what are today called patriotic values, family values, American values. And it's also pretty clear Wayne was ardently pro Nixon in the 1960 presidential campaign and ardently anti Kennedy in his mind, believed that this type of huge shout out of American patriot values could somehow defeat John F. Kennedy. I like how these people seem to think that they know what everybody is thinking. Like they're mind readers and they can read the minds of the dead of what they were thinking when they were alive. That's great stuff. I mean, the fact that they're just writing a book with that kind of talent. The movie most reviewers would tell you is a mess. It perpetuates every hoary Alamo myth, and yet it spoke to a certain cross section of American and international viewers. It was really the thing that more than anything caused the Alamo to become the international icon that it's become. On how the Anglo-centric narrative of the Alamo history has affected Latino kids. Mexican American kids can grow up in Texas believing they're Americans, with the Statue of Liberty and all that, until seventh grade, when you were taught, in essence, that if you're Mexican, your ancestors killed Davy Crockett, that's the kind of original sin of the Texas creation myth. Oh, you mean kind of how, like, you can grow up in America being told that now you're racist because your ancestors may have held slaves in the past? You mean that kind of stuff? What? I don't think any Hispanic child is thinking this. I really want to know where they got their talent for mind reading. Did they actually talk to people, or do they just imagine this is what people think? It has been used just anecdotally for generations to put down Mexican Americans. A big, beefy white guy going up to the little Mexican guy and punching him in the arm and saying, "Remember the Alamo," that type of thing. Let me finish reading this. To an amazing degree, maybe because the Texas media are still dominated by Anglos as well as the Texas government, that viewpoint has just never really gotten into the mainstream. By and large, anytime you've had any type of Latino voice come out and question the traditional Anglo narrative, they've been shouted down. I don't know about that either. Um, One thing you have to remember is that the the war over Texas independence, it was not just fought by white people. There was Hispanic people that fought. There were people that came from other parts of America that fought. There were I know there was an Irish person. I don't know if it was multiple, but I do know at least an Irish person came and fought in that war. And you had almost everything stacked up against these people, and the Bank of England was backing Mexico to fight this war. And this was a global thing. This wasn't just some white men in Texas. So, since we know that they're morons and they don't do their history or their research, we have this guy. His name is, where's his full name? Patterson is his last name. Jerry Patterson. Okay. So, what Jerry Patterson does is Jerry Patterson, um, he's the Texas Land. He was the former Texas Land Commissioner and Alamo caretaker. Okay, so he took care of a lot of stuff. There was some article in the Texas Monthly about this book, Forget the Alamo, and so Jerry Patterson came out with a full response to this article, because he said he's sick and tired of the woke BS about Texas history. He said, "You must read it. It will give you the ammunition you need to spread the truth." So, his response was, regarding the Come and Fake It article in the June issue, I think the authors, which is Chris Tomlinson, Jason Stanford, and Brian Burrows, need to brush up on their fact checking skills. They erroneously assert that as land commissioner, I agreed to quote unquote display a collection in its entirety without authenticating every item, and that I failed to seek independent assessments of the Collins artifacts before or after promising to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on a museum that would display every single one of them. So, Phil Collins, he um, donated a huge array of things that he had to this museum. He said, "This is demonstrably false. Under the contract I signed on behalf of the General Land Office with Phil Collins, there is no requirement to display every single item of his donated collection. In fact, in the October 29, 2014 contract, Collins granted to me and my successors acting on behalf of the Texas General Land Office complete discretion to display or not display any particular item." So, this is really nothing that has to do with the history of the Alamo. Just there's other stuff that's going on. So, in both Come and Fake It and Chris Tomlinson's May 20 column in the Houston Chronicle, my agreement to build a state of the art museum is repeatedly mischaracterized. So he's still talking about the museum. Even without the Collins collection, we didn't have room to display all the Alamo related artifacts we already had at the Alamo. We needed a museum then, and we need a museum now, even without the 207 items in Collins' collection. So I guess they're making a big deal about this museum. There's obviously a lot of stuff that they want to put on display. So, um, the authors raise issues on about a dozen artifacts, okay? In the foreword of Collins' book, historian and author Stephen L. Hardin states that the pro- uh, provenance of some items is subject to question and notes that acceptance of questions and criticisms is a legitimate part of the historian's method. So, um, even Collins is commenting that it's unclear the origins of multiple items. Um, so, whatever. Um, I hate to rain on the author's parade of startling revelations. Actually, I don't. But the idea that the General Land Office and/or Commissioner Jerry Patterson were duped by Phil Collins or anyone else is just false. Collins is as much a benefactor to Texas as were the citizens of Cincinnati, Ohio, when they gifted Texas with the Twin Sisters cannon that helped carry the day at San Jacinto, Texas. Thank you, Phil Collins. Oh, San Jacinto, Texas. Thanks you, Phil Collins. Speaking of the twin sisters, the authors go to archaeologist Tom Nuckols makes yet another of the book's demonstrably false assertions when he claims we don't know what caliber the cannonballs were. So, I mean, they're just like all over the place. The overwhelming majority of historians know they were of 6-pound caliber. President Sam Houston and Texas Secretary of War Thomas Rusk said they were 6-pounders. President David J. Burnett did as well. Ben McCullough and John Farrell, who were actually in San Jacinto Artillery Detachment, said they were 6-pounders, and Texas Army Ordnance reports after 1836 all list them as 6-pounders. Were the cannonballs from San Jacinto? With only one battle there, one can conclude a cannonball documented to have been found at San Jacinto comes from that battle. Was it fired from the Twin Sisters? Since Texas had 2 cannons and Mexico's had 1, yes, it probably was. If the cannonball was found in the Mexican position, it was likely fired by the Texans and vice versa. Add the fact that the single Mexican cannon is thought to have fired only 3 times, a reasonable person would conclude a twin sister attribution is well founded. This error-ridden book chapter, unfortunately published in Texas Monthly without fact-checking, is prelude to the big lie the authors tell in their rush to rewrite history and forget the Alamo. Though only given a nod in the Texas Monthly article, the main premise in the book is that the Texas Revolution was really all about slavery. Once again, they ignore or give short shrift to facts that undermine their argument. I think they mean shift and they just misspelled it. This is another thing that is becoming very popular among the woke crowd is to make everything about slavery. Anything that a white man stood against is because he was standing against ending slavery. And that's not true because not every white man fought to keep slavery or wanted slavery. That's not true. And let's not forget the history, and I'll look it up before the end of the episode. Let's not forget the history of the black man who went to court and won his case to own slaves himself. A black man who owned black slaves. What do you mean? Yes, black people also owned slaves. Just saying. Don't get it twisted that there weren't other people who did terrible things. In fact, if we're going to just talk about slavery here for a second, it was black people who sold black people through the slave trade. Africans sold their own people in the slave trade to make money. So while slavery was wrong, it's not solely condemned to white people are not the ones that should be solely condemned. Anybody who participated in it should, obviously that it wasn't a good practice, but also it was a practice that was all over the world. And where people get this idea that America was unique in the slave trade and that nobody else did it. Yes, I think that there were other people that were trying to get rid of slavery in their countries. Like in Europe, they were working on getting rid of slavery there. But America is unique in the fact that we were one of the first, or if not, I'm pretty sure, I have to check it and double check this, but I'm pretty sure we were the first country to rid slavery out of our system. And I know 90 years sounds like a really long time, but for the fact that there's still slavery going on in the world today, it's very unique to American history. And you can't condemn the whole country forever, or half the country, or the majority of the country, whoever you're blaming to be a part of it, who actually wasn't a part of it. You can't do that. I'm not to blame for slavery. You're not to blame for slavery. Why are we acting like we were a part of this horrible time in history when we weren't? The thing is, the more time went on, the more enlightened people became and realized, we're not better just because of the way we look. We should all be treated the same. And even though we had these high standards set in our founding documents, and we failed to meet those standards when we first started as a country, all we have done year after year, decade after decade, century after century, from the beginning to now, was we strived to be the country that our founding documents wanted us to be, the way we intended to start out. And we'd done a pretty good job until Obama came into office and started dividing everybody by race. That's when all this started. Go look up when BLM came into fruition and started doing their stuff. That was under Obama. That's when the race baiting started. I mean, there's always been race baiting in government, but that's when it got really, really big. So, continuing on. So, number one, when writing about the causes of the Texas Revolution, it would seem obvious to review and refer to the 6 general and 14 specific causes for rebellion listed in the March 2nd, 1836 Texas Declaration of Independence. Not one of the 20 listed causes mentioned slavery. If slavery were a cause, I guess it didn't rank any higher than number 21. The authors should address this inconvenient fact, not ignore it. So, what did I do? Well, where did it go? Oh no. I pulled that up, didn't I? Okay. I don't know what happened because I did pull that up. Um, let's see. I had that whole document pulled up. So, we're going to do that right now. It was a PDF that I had pulled up because I wanted to look at it. Right here. I don't know where this went. Okay. So, the Texas Declaration of Independence. When a government has ceased to protect the lives, liberty, and property of the people from whom its legitimate powers are derived, and for the advancement of whose happiness it was instituted, and so far from being a guarantee for the enjoyment of those inestimable and inalienable rights, becomes an instrument in the hands of evil rulers for their oppression. When the federal republican constitution of their country, which they have sworn to support, no longer has a substantial existence, and the whole nature of their government has been forcibly changed without their consent from a restricted federative republic composed of sovereign states to a consolidated central military excuse me, despotism in which every interest is disregarded but that of the army and the priesthood, both the eternal enemies of civil liberty and ever ready minions of power, and the usual instruments of tyrants. When, long after the spirit of the Constitution has departed, moderation is at length so far lost by those in power that even the semblance of freedom is removed, and the forms themselves of the Constitution discontinued, and so far from their petitions and remonstrances being regarded, the agents who bear them are thrown into dungeons, and mercenary armies sent forth to force a new government upon them at the point of the bayonet. When, in consequence of such acts of malfeasance and abdication, On the part of the government, anarchy prevails and civil society is dissolved into its original elements. In such a crisis, the first law of nature, the right of self preservation, the inherent and inalienable rights of the people to appeal to first principles and take their political affairs into their own hands in extreme cases, enjoins it as a right towards themselves and a sacred obligation to their posterity to abolish such government and create another in its stead, calculated to rescue them from impending dangers and to secure their future welfare and happiness. Nations as well as individuals are amenable for their acts to the public opinion of mankind. A statement of a part of our grievances is therefore submitted to an impartial world in justification of the hazardous but unavoidable step now taken of severing our political connection with the Mexican people and assuming an independent attitude among the nations of the earth. The Mexican government, by its colonization laws, invited and induced the Anglo American population of Texas to colonize its wilderness under the pledged faith of a written constitution that they should continue to enjoy that constitutional liberty and republican government to which they had been habituated in the land of their birth, the United States of America. In this expectation they have been cruelly disappointed, inasmuch as the Mexican nation has acquiesced in the late changes made in the government by General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, who, having overturned the constitution of his country, now offers us the cruel alternative either to abandon our homes, acquired by so many privations, or submit to the most intolerable of all tyranny, the combined despotism of the sword and the priesthood. So Santa Anna, one thing, was trying to force everybody to be Catholic, and the majority of the Texians and the Tejanos that were in Texas were Protestant at the time. And I think it was mostly the Texians were Protestant, but he was trying to force everybody to be Catholic. And even though Texas was its own republic and they had a constitution, Santa Anna was just ignoring it and not following it and was just like, nope, I'm going to take control and I'm going to be over Texas. And Texas wasn't having it. So it wasn't just white people, it was, Hispanic people as well. And I think a couple black people that were not slaves, they lived there, they also fought. Okay, it has sacrificed our welfare to the state of Coahuila, by which our interests have been continually depressed through a jealous and partial course of legislation, carried on at a far distant seat of government by a hostile majority in an unknown tongue, and this too, notwithstanding we have petitioned in the humblest terms, and have, in accordance with the provisions of the national constitution, presented to the General Congress a Republican constitution which was without just cause contemptuously rejected. It incarcerated in a dungeon for a long time one of our citizens for no other cause but a zealous endeavor to procure the acceptance of our Constitution and the establishment of a state government. It has failed and refused to secure on a firm basis the right of trial by jury, that palladium of civil liberty and only safe guarantee for the life, liberty, and property of the citizen. It has failed to establish any public system of education, although possessed of almost boundless resources, the public domain, and although it is an axiom in political science that unless a people are educated and enlightened, it is idle to expect the continuance of civil liberty or the capacity for self government. It has suffered the military commandants stationed among us to exercise arbitrary acts of oppression and tyranny, thus trampling upon the most sacred rights of the citizens and rendering the military superior to the civil power. It has dissolved by force of arms the state congress of Coahuila, uh, Co- Coahuila, I don't know how to say it, in Texas, and obliged our representatives to fly for their lives from the seat of government, thus depriving us of the fundamental political right of representation. It has demanded the surrender of a number of our citizens and ordered military detachments to seize and carry them into the interior for trial in contempt of the civil authorities and in defiance of the laws and the Constitution. It has made piratical attacks upon our commerce by commissioning foreign desperadoes and authorizing them to seize our vessels and convey the property of our citizens to far distant ports for confiscation. It denies us the right of worshiping the Almighty according to the dictates of our own conscience by the support of a national religion calculated to promote the temporal interest of its human functionaries rather than the glory of the true and living God. I believe that they mean the money that the Catholic Church brings in and that they are corrupt and using it for themselves. It has demanded us to deliver up our arms, which are essential to our defense, the rightful property of free men, and formidable only to tyrannical governments. It has invaded our country both by sea and by land, with intent to lay waste our territory and drive us from our homes, and has now a large mercenary army advancing to carry on against us a war of extermination. It has, through its emissaries, indicted or incited the merciless savage with the tomahawk and scalping knife to massacre the inhabitants of our defenseless frontiers. It hath been, during the whole time of our connection with it, the contemptible sport and victim of successive military revolutions, and hath continually exhibited every characteristic of a weak, corrupt, and tyrannical government. These and other grievances were patiently borne by the people of Texas until they reached that point at which forbearance ceases to be a virtue. We then took up arms in defense of the national constitution. We appealed to our Mexican brethren for assistance. Our appeal has been made in vain. Though months have elapsed, no sympathetic response has yet been heard from the interior. We are therefore forced to the melancholy conclusion that the Mexican people have acquiesced in the destruction of their liberty and the substitution, therefore, of a military government, that they are unfit to be free and incapable of self government. The necessity of self preservation, therefore, now decrees our eternal political separation. We, therefore, the delegates with plenary powers of the people of Texas, in solemn convention assembled appealing to a candid world for the necessities of our condition, do hereby resolve and declare that our political connection with the Mexican nation has forever ended, and that the people of Texas do now constitute a free, sovereign, and independent republic, and are fully invested with all the rights and attributes which properly belong to independent nations, and conscious of the rectitude of our intentions, we fearlessly and confidently commit the issue to the decision of the supreme arbiter of the destinies of nations. Richard Ellis, President of the Convention and delegate from Red River, James Collinsworth, Edwin Waller, Asa Brigham, Charles B. Stewart, um, though Thomas Barnett, and John S. D. Byram. That's who signed it. Oh, no, there's many, many more. Looks like a lot of people, the blue highlighted names, Antonio Navarro, Lorenzo de Zavala, Sterling C. Robertson, Sam Houston, Thomas Jefferson Rusk. Um, so you see there are some Hispanic people that are a part of this. Navarro, Zavala. Um, trying to see if there's any more. Looks like that's about it. But, I mean, um, these people were serious, okay? So they were serious. So this idea that these people know what they're talking about, they don't. Um, Number two, there were five other Mexican states: Zacatecas, Yucatan, Tabasco, Nuevo Leon, and Tamu- Tamaulipas. Gosh, I butchered those. In rebellion at some time during the same period of 1835 to 1846, and they were non-slave holding states. This would indicate there were other far more significant reasons for revolution, reasons that were shared across Mexico, including in Texas. Santa Anna's enactment in the 1835 of Siete Leyes, or Seven Laws, nullified the federal constitution of 1824 that had given power to the states, disbanded state legislatures, and replaced elected governors with appointed ones. This was not well received and was considered the last straw by many. Texans, as did citizens of other Mexican states, fought for a return to the Constitution of 1824. In fact, one of the Texas battle flags was a Mexican tricolor that featured 1824 in the center white panel. For the majority of prominent Texans who identified with the Peace Party, the faction in pre-war Texas that from 1832 to late 1835 opposed war and wanted to maintain Texas as its own state within Mexico, were slave owners. Prominent among this group were Stephen F. Austin, Thomas J. Chambers, David G. Burnett, and Josiah Bell. Ironically, Austin, as the book conclusively proves, was a slavery supporter who opposed war and independence until very end. The authors would have us believe the war was overwhelmingly about slavery, notwithstanding that many of those who opposed the war were themselves slave owners. The vast majority of Texas combatants were not slave owners. Would they be willing to die for those of the slave owner planter class? They were certainly opponents of slavery in the Texas ranks. In fact, one of those who fought at Gonzales and later died at the Alamo was Amos Pollard, a well educated physician who came to Texas from Massachusetts. Pollard was an ardent abolitionist who corresponded with the prominent abolitionist of the day, William Lloyd Garrison, who published Pollard's letter in the abolitionist pamphlet, The Liberator. I applaud the author's zeal in insisting we tell the whole story instead of the Anglo good, Mexican bad narrative we suffered through for 100+ years. I hate to break it to them, though, this is not a new idea. In fact, the Daughters of the Republic of Texas decades ago began seriously recognizing the Tejano contribution to our history, and during my tenure at the GLO, every speech I gave on the Alamo, I recited the names of the 7 known Tejanos who died there and added that the first illegals, quote unquote, crossing a river into Texas were Anglos crossing the Sabine River, not Mexicanos coming across the Rio Grande, or Rio Bravo as it's known in Mexico. We should never gloss over abuses and shortcomings of those historical icons from Texas history. That is why in 2015, I, along with author Glenn Justice, Austin lobbyist Lee Woods, and Sol Ross, University archaeologist David Keller, organized an archaeological expedition to the site of the 1918 Porvenir massacre. At Porvenir, Texas Rangers and local ranchers murdered 15 innocent Tejanos, arguably the darkest chapter in an otherwise honorable history of the legacy law enforcement agency in Texas. Our archaeology was featured in a documentary movie that premiered on PBS and is now available on Amazon Prime. I am no stranger to telling the whole story, warts and all, of Texas history. The purpose behind Forget the Alamo is to sell copies, not to add to the body of history. Nothing wrong with that in the least. In the woke world we find ourselves in, their timing is impeccable. Their facts, however, are not impeccable, and I hope and trust Texas Monthly will set the record straight about the Collins collection and include the rest of the story as it relates to the Texas Revolution. The good and the bad. Texas Monthly might even consider thanking Phil Collins. Remember the Alamo, Jerry Patterson. So, this is not to say that there aren't bad things that have happened in Texas history, but that what they're trying to portray, the Texas Revolution was about slavery, is wrong. And they want to tear down the Alamo. That's the whole point of this. They've been tearing down all these statues. They want to get rid of the Alamo and tear it down. And they better not lay a stinking finger on the Alamo because it is very significant, not just to white Americans, but Mexican Americans. Because let's remember, if the Mexican people that were in Texas had decided just to go back to Mexico when Texas wanted to claim its independence, they would have had a far much worse life than they had staying with Texas. It was better for them. That's why they fought. That's why they stayed. Because they knew it was a better life. So it's just, there's so much wrong with what they're saying. And I mean, I'm already at 40 minutes. I don't know if I have time to even go over the rest of what I had brought up. But let's see if I can just skim through this one. So this is from the History Channel. And it's Texas declares its independence. So during the Texas Revolution, the Convention of American Texans meets at Washington on the Brazos and declares the independence of Texas from Mexico. The delegates chose David Burnett as provisional president and confirmed Sam Houston as the commander in chief of all Texas forces. The Texans also adopted a constitution that protected the free practice of slavery, which had been prohibited by Mexican law. But you got to remember, Stephen F. Austin, who was very prominent with among the Texans, he was a slave owner and opposed any type of war. And if you go look at the history of like Sam Houston, so he was very close with the Cherokees and he did a lot of good for the Native Americans in the Texas area. And even Davy Crockett, who lived with a native tribe for a while, he lost his seat in government because he was defending the Native American tribes. So they are trying to paint Sam Houston and Davy Crockett as these horrible racists, and they're really not. They're just not. Um, In 1834, Santa Anna, a soldier and politician, became dictator of Mexico and sought to crush rebellions in Texas and other areas. In October 1835, Anglo residents of Gonzales, 50 miles east of San Antonio, responded to Santa Anna's demands that they return a cannon loaned for defense against Indian attack by discharging it against the Mexican troops sent to reclaim it. The Mexicans were routed in what is regarded as the first battle of the Texas Revolution. The American settlers set up a provisional state government, and a Texan army under Sam Houston won a series of minor battles in the fall of 1835. So, and then they also have another one that was updated. I didn't read all of this one, but I have noticed the History Channel, who is supposed to be history, doesn't even tell the story right either. They just don't. Um, Says here that military troops, first Spanish, then rebel, and later Mexican occupied the Alamo during and after Mexico's war for independence from Spain in the early 1820s. Here's what's funny too is the fact that um, Mexico fought for its independence out of Spain, and then when Texas wants to be its own independent state and they want to, you know, hunker down and rule over them, they don't like the fact that Texas wants to fight a war for its independence when they just did the same thing not many years before. It's just it's really weird. Um So in 1835, the early stages of Texas War for Independence from Mexico, a group of Texan or Texian volunteers led by George Collinsworth and Benjamin Millam overwhelmed the Mexican garrison at the Alamo and captured the fort, seizing control of San Antonio. By mid-February 1836, Colonel James Bowie and Lieutenant Colonel William B. Travis had taken command of Texan forces in San Antonio. Though Sam Houston, the newly appointed commander-in-chief of the Texan forces, argued that San Antonio should be abandoned due to insufficient troops numbers, the Alamo's defenders, led by Bowie and Travis, dug in nonetheless, prepared to defend the fort to the last. These defenders, who, despite later reinforcements, never numbered more than 200, included Davy Crockett, the famous frontiersman and former congressman from Tennessee, who had arrived in early February. Um, the Texans held out for 13 days, but on the morning of March 6th, Mexican forces broke through a breach in the outer wall of the courtyard and overpowered them. Santa Anna ordered his men to take no prisoners, and only a small handful of the Texans were spared. One of these was Susanna Dickinson, the wife and captain Almaron Dickinson, who was killed, and her infant daughter Angelina. Santa Anna sent them to Houston's camp in Gonzales with the warning that a similar fate awaited the rest of the Texans if they continued their revolt. The Mexican forces also suffered heavy casualties in the Battle of the Alamo, losing between 600 and 1,600 men. From March to May, Mexican forces once again occupied the Alamo. For the Texans, the Battle of the Alamo became a symbol of heroic resistance and a rallying cry in their struggle for independence. On April 21st, 1836, Sam Houston and some 800 Texans defeated Santa Anna's Mexican force of 1,500 men at San Jacinto, near the site of the present-day Houston, shouting, "Remember the Alamo," as they attacked. The victory ensured the success of Texas independence. Santa Anna, who had been taken prisoner, came to terms with Houston to the end of the war. In May, Mexican troops in San Antonio were ordered to withdraw and to demolish the Alamo's fortifications as they went. Sam Houston, he took prisoners and he worked out something with Santa Anna. Santa Anna was like, "No prisoners, let's just kill them all." In 1845, the United States annexed Texas. For many years afterward, the U.S. Army quartered troops and stored supplies at the Alamo. The Alamo remained a symbol of courage, and in the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848, U.S. soldiers revived the "Remember the Alamo" battle cry while fighting against Mexican forces. The Alamo has been commemorated on everything from postage stamps to the 1960 film The Alamo starring John Wayne as Davy Crockett. In 1883, the state of Texas purchased the Alamo, later acquiring property rights to all the surrounding grounds. The Daughters of the Republic of Texas, a women's organization including descendants of the earliest Texan residents, has managed the Alamo since 1905. Today, more than 2.5 million people a year visit the Alamo. The 4.2-acre site includes some original structures dating back to the Mission period. So, thing is, the Alamo is very important. Gaining Texas independence, very important. And these lies that are being perpetrated by these leftist woke idiots to rewrite history, as they always do, to stir up division. But one thing I need people to realize: Texans don't go down that easy. We don't put up with this messing around with our state, messing around with our history. We don't play that game. And they're not going to get away with this. I can tell you that. This isn't going to happen. They're never going to get to tear down the Alamo. One other thing I wanted to do, though, something I thought that might be kind of cool, is to take a look at this list of 17 things that you never knew about the Alamo. There's some things that I never knew about the Alamo, like Phil Collins donating a bunch of stuff. I didn't know that. So let's just take a quick look. We know, number one, that Phil Collins has his own collection there. It's he donated his $15 million trove of artifacts, and it includes Bowie knives, Davy Crockett's leather bullet pouch, a Mexican army helmet, Spanish swords, flintlock pistols, and dozens of historical documents. So that's cool. They're on display in rotating exhibits. Number two, it's full of bullet holes and old bottles. So the pot marks from bullets fired during the Battle of the Alamo can still be seen on the front of the building. They can be hard to spot, but a guide can help point them out. There's also bits of old bottles that poke out from some of the walls because soldiers doing the repairs in the mid 1800s gathered fill material from the local dump. So that's kind of cool. Its history stretches back to 1700, so it was the first Spanish mission. It was known as Mission San Francisco de Solano, and it was built near the Rio Grande River. It was a central location of San Antonio and was later determined to be an ideal jumping off point for continued expansion. So, the mission, now known as the Alamo, was originally called San Antonio de Valero. Construction started on the building and surrounding complex in 1744. Number four, the Spanish government wanted taxpayers. So the Spanish missionaries tried to convert the Native Americans to Catholicism, and that was only part of the plan. They also wanted to turn them into farmers, ranchers, and Spanish taxpayers. So the original Alamo site was surrounded by farmland and ranching facilities. The tribes that cooperated with the Spanish often had ulterior motives of their own. Some were simply poor and starving, and the Spanish offered food and shelter. Others sought protection from the Apaches and Comanches in the region. Plagues of smallpox and other European diseases periodically decimated the native population, making the Spanish expansion plan unworkable. Number five, where the name comes from. So by the 1790s, the Spanish military had taken over Santa Ana de Valero. In 1803, a new group of soldiers and their families moved onto the site. Their Spanish name translates as the Second Flying Company of San Carlos de Parras. Flying companies were those that were trained to fight on horseback. So it was based in a town called Alamo de Parras. Alamo is the Spanish word for cottonwood trees. Oh, I didn't know that, which are common in the region. It's also informally known as the Alamo Company. On the One of the Mexican generals invented chewing gum. So Mexican General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, he continued a rocky military and political career in Mexico. Um, he presented an investment idea to an American inventor, Thomas Adams, in New York City. Though Santa Anna thought that Mexican chicle, a tree resin chewed in Mexico since Aztec times, might be useful as cheaper substitute for rubber. It didn't work out, but Adams later made a fortune by turning chicle into a more refined chewing gum. Um, Number seven, it was the site of the first hospital in Texas. So from 1803 to 1835, Spanish soldiers lived and worked on the Alamo grounds, and the convento or priest quarters was converted into barracks. Um, they still sustained frequent injuries, even though they had a thick leather armor, at the hands of hostile tribes in the area. So the second floor of the convento became a hospital. Number eight, it was the first of five missions in San Antonio. In 2015, the Alamo and the four other San Antonio missions were designated as UNESCO World Heritage Sites, joining the ranks of the Taj Mahal and Stonehenge. Well, that's pretty cool. Number nine, the original didn't have a roof. Yeah, the original it didn't have a roof. Number 10, the parapet was added in the 1850s. That spread the columns and the bell sit. Um, it makes it pretty. Number 11, where the native tribes went. So, although many indigenous peoples in Texas were decimated by war and disease, the long term intermingling of the Spanish and the native tribes led to the virtual disappearance of some tribes through marriage. So, it only became legal after the indigenous people abandoned their own religion and converted to Catholicism. Number 12, there was unchecked immigration from the United States. Yes, they encouraged residents of the nearby United States to move to Texas, which was then known as Coahuila y Tejas. Initially, the region was hard to govern from Mexico City because it was remote and sparsely populated. There you go. The first major colonist, Stephen F. Austin, was essentially acting as an agent of the Mexican government. Before moving toward independence, the new settlers simply wanted Tejas to be its own Mexican state. Instead, it was lumped into the sprawling Coahuila province, and most of the leaders with real political power lived far away. Wow, that's crazy. There's so many more. A small cannon started it all at number 13. 14, a stubborn teacher saved part of it, Adina de Zavala. Um, Number 15, the first film about it was made in 1914, The Siege and Fall of the Alamo, Royal Theater in 1914. 16, Ozzy Osbourne's famous Desecration. He never actually urinated on the Alamo, so that's a lie. And number 17, oh, Ozzy also donated $10,000 to the Daughters of the Republic of Texas in 1992. Osbourne returned to the Alamo in 2015 to film a segment for Ozzy and Jack's World Detour, a reality TV series. At number 17, it was almost abandoned before the battle. Sam Houston concluded the mission was indefensible and they almost left, but Bowie and Colonel James C. Neal made the case to Houston that the loss of the Alamo would be strategically devastating. So there you go. Anyway, the whole point is that this is a lie about Texas history, and they shouldn't be allowed to change and rewrite history because they don't like what it really stands for. It doesn't fit their narrative. They need to make all people look bad and all wanted slavery, and that's why everybody fought wars and divide everybody up. We can't let them do that. We can't. So let's stand up and fight against it. Thank you so much for joining me today. This was just a little Texas history lesson. I'm very passionate about my state, and I will defend it to the very end. Please join me on my Facebook, Lauren Collins. I just gotta say something. You can shoot me an email, gotta say something 21 at gmail.com. Also, please like and share this video, subscribe, comment. All the support really means a lot to me. I've added new listeners to my podcast from Italy and Colombia and Lebanon. And I think there was another one, but I can't remember. And it really means a lot to me. Please go subscribe to the Scott Ford Show, Isaac Hayes at the Cajun Conservative, and his Christian podcast, Brothers Just Searching. My friend Christy at the Lennar Score on Facebook, and her YouTube channel, Christy's Closet, where she will sing, and TV's Robinson Woke. These are great people. I know you're going to love them. Thank you again for joining me, and have a really, really good rest of your day. God bless.